I faked bankruptcy and became homeless for 3 days. My two wealthy sons tossed some pocket change and closed their doors. My youngest, a mechanic with a humble home, gave me his bed without hesitation. His wife was so determined to help that she sold her wedding rings. The next morning, when my lawyer walked through that door with legal documents and a check, the look on their faces was unforgettable. What they didn't know was that I had already seen who they truly were. I'm truly grateful that you're here with me today. Before we continue, take a moment to tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Your voice matters, and I read more comments than you might think. Just a quick note before we begin, some elements of this story have been fictionalized for storytelling and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people or places is coincidental, but the message itself is completely real. The silence of my penthouse was suffocating. Not the comfortable kind of quiet that comes with solitude, but the heavy, suffocating kind that reminds you of everything you've lost. I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows on the 23rd floor of my Manhattan tower, watching the city lights flicker below me like dying stars. The view stretched endlessly east to the bridges, west toward the Hudson, north to the endless sprawl of the 5 boroughs. 62 years of building something, and this was what I'd earned: a magnificent cage suspended above a city full of people. My wife would have loved this view. She always said the best part of being successful wasn't the money or the status, it was the perspective. From up here you could see how small everything really was, how small our problems were. She'd been gone 12 years now, and some nights I still turned to tell her something, forgetting for just a moment that she wasn't there anymore. The penthouse felt different these days, empty in a way that cleaning staff and furniture couldn't fix. My 3 sons had visited maybe twice in the last 5 years. Brandon had made an excuse about his schedule. James mentioned something about work. Kyle had called wanting to know if I was eating well, if I was sleeping enough. Even then, I could hear the exhaustion in his voice, a mechanic's exhaustion, the kind that comes from caring too much about people who don't always care back. I was pouring myself a bourbon when the phone rang the first time. It was Brandon, my oldest, the one I'd put through Harvard Law School. $350,000 for his education alone, and he'd come out the other side polished and sharp as a blade. "Brandon, how are you?" I tried to keep my voice warm. "I'm good. Listen, I need to talk to you about something." He didn't sound particularly warm back. He sounded like someone calling to ask a favor. "I've got an opportunity, a business venture with a partner, but I need capital. I need $280,000. $280,000. Not, how are you? Not, I miss you. Not even small talk. Just a number." "That's a significant amount, Brandon. Tell me about the opportunity." I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe this was legitimate. Maybe he actually needed my help. He launched into an explanation that felt rehearsed, vague on details, heavy on confidence. The kind of pitch you give to someone you're trying to convince, not to someone you love. By the time he finished, I already knew what I was going to say, but I asked him anyway. "Will you come to dinner next week? We could talk about this in person." There was a pause. I could practically hear him scrolling through his calendar in his mind. "That's going to be tough, Dad. My schedule is crazy right now, but I need an answer on the capital soon. Can you just wire it to my account?" He wanted the money by wire. Not a conversation, not a relationship, just a transaction. I told him I'd think about it, and we said goodbye in the way people do when there's nothing else to say. The second call came 30 minutes later. James, my middle son. The one I'd invested $280,000 in for MIT. He'd become a software engineer, successful, wealthy, driven. We were supposed to have a father-son bond, 2 men who understood business and ambition. Instead, we had a relationship that felt like two executives checking in before moving on to the next meeting. "Hi, Dad. I'm glad I caught you." He sounded rushed, preoccupied. "I've got something I want to run by you. There's a startup opportunity, and if I get in early, the returns could be significant. I need 200,000 to make it happen." 200,000. Another number. Another son asking for money instead of asking how I was doing. "James, that's substantial. I know it's a lot, but this is the kind of opportunity that doesn't wait. I need to know if you can move on this quickly." I listened as he explained the venture, his words clipped and efficient. He was trying to convince me, not connect with me. When he finished, I asked the same question I'd asked Brandon. "Can you come to dinner? We could discuss this properly." "Maybe next month, Dad. Things are pretty intense at work. But can you let me know about the capital, money, cash transfer?" That's what I was to my two oldest sons, a resource to be tapped when convenient. "I'll get back to you," I said, and we hung up. I sat in the dark of my penthouse for a long time after that second call, not touching my bourbon. Two sons, two requests, two reminders that somewhere along the line I'd become something other than a father. I'd become a bank with a heartbeat. The third call came at 8:45 p.m. "Dad, hi. I hope I'm not calling too late." It was Kyle, my youngest, the one who became a mechanic instead of going after the big money. The one the family had quietly pitied for years, myself included. Something in his voice was different. Something was genuine. "Kyle, it's good to hear from you. How are you doing?" "I'm good, Dad. Really good, actually. Sophie and I have been talking about some stuff and everything's good. I hadn't talked to you in a while and I wanted to call and see how you were. Are you eating okay? Are you taking care of yourself?" He wasn't asking for anything. He was asking about me. I couldn't remember the last time one of my sons had asked me how I was doing without wanting something in return. Not Brandon, not James, but Kyle, the one I'd never quite understood, the one who'd chosen a modest life over the pursuit of fortune. He called just to check in. We talked for 20 minutes. About his work, about Sophie, about nothing important and everything that mattered. When we hung up, I felt something shift inside me. Something broke open, or maybe something crystallized. I wasn't sure which. I sat in the dark and made a decision. As I sat in the darkness, those 3 phone calls replaying in my mind, another memory surfaced. Not from tonight, but from years past. Years of decisions that had felt right at the time, that had seemed like investments in their futures. I had given them everything. That wasn't hyperbole, it was a simple fact I could measure in dollar signs and years of sacrifice. Brandon had always been the brightest one. Sharp as a knife, ambitious from childhood. When he got into Harvard Law School, I didn't hesitate. $350,000. I remember the conversation with my accountant. He'd asked if I was sure if that was too much. I told him it wasn't about the money. It was about possibility. Harvard Law meant connections. It meant a future. It meant my son would never have to struggle the way I had struggled. I'd paid for every semester, paid for his apartment near campus, paid for the internships he secured in Manhattan, the ones that led to his current position at an elite firm. I'd watched him graduate proud and glowing, and I'd thought, this is what hard work buys you. This is what sacrifice looks like when it pays off. But when had Brandon called me just to talk? When had he asked about my day, my health, my life? The answer was simple: never. The calls always came with a request attached, a need, a problem that required money to solve. James had been different in personality. Quieter, more methodical. But the investment was the same. $280,000 for MIT computer science degree. The promise of the tech world. I'd paid for his education, his first apartment in San Francisco, connections that got him into the companies that made him wealthy. I'd been so proud. My son, a software engineer at a prestigious firm. My son making 6 figures before he was 30. When he called me about his latest venture, his startup opportunity, there was no pretense of affection. Just a pitch. Just a number. Just the assumption that I would open my wallet, because that's what I was there for. What had I created? And then there was Kyle. Kyle the youngest, the one who'd surprised us all by choosing a trade school instead of a prestigious university. $45,000, a fraction of what I'd spent on his brothers. Vocational training to become a mechanic. I'd paid for it, of course, but I'd also felt something I'm ashamed to admit now, disappointment. I'd wanted more for him, something grander, something that would look better at family gatherings, but Kyle had never asked for another dollar. Not once in all these years. He'd built his own life, modest as it was. He'd married Sophie, a kind woman who cut hair for a living. They rented a small house in Asheville. No penthouse, no corner office, no 6-figure salary. And tonight, Kyle had called me just to ask if I was eating well, if I was sleeping enough. Kyle, the son I'd given the least to, was the one who'd given me something invaluable: his attention, his genuine concern, his love without an agenda. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I had spent over $600,000 on 3 sons, and 2 of them had repaid that investment with calculation and greed. The third one, the one I'd secretly viewed as less successful, had given me something money could never buy. He'd given me his time, his care, his presence without expectation. I stood up from the darkness and walked to my desk. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in months. Howard. My voice sounded different in the silence, smaller somehow, more fragile. It's Charles. I need your help with something important. Howard Mitchell was my oldest friend, a lawyer I'd known since college. He was trustworthy, discreet, and he understood complications. Of course. What's going on? He asked. I took a breath. The decision I was about to speak into existence felt enormous and terrifying and necessary all at once. I need to disappear, I said quietly. Not forever, just for a few days. I need to become someone my sons don't recognize, someone with nothing, and I need your help to set it up. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Charles, what are you talking about? I need to know who they really are, I continued. Not the versions of themselves they show me when they need something. I need to see them when they think I'm nobody. I need to understand if there's anything left of them besides greed. Howard tried to talk me out of it. That was the first thing he did when I explained what I wanted to do. Charles, you're 62 years old, he said, sitting across from me in my study, his face creased with concern. You're talking about living on the streets for 3 days. Do you understand the risks? The health risks alone. I understand, I interrupted. That's why I need your help. I need you to keep me safe while I do this unsafely. He didn't smile at the paradox. Instead, he pulled out a leather notebook and started making notes. Howard Mitchell had been my lawyer for 35 years. He'd learned long ago that when I made up my mind, arguing was a waste of time. What he could do instead was minimize the damage. We spent 2 hours going over the details. A burner phone, cheap, untraceable. A security team that would keep their distance watching from nearby locations. A car waiting 2 blocks away from wherever I ended up. A signal if anything went truly wrong. Howard made me promise that if the streets became unbearable, if I felt unsafe, I would call him immediately. I will, I lied. We both knew I wouldn't. By 11 that night, I was standing in my walk-in closet, the one that took up more space than most people's bedrooms, and I began to dismantle myself. The expensive suits came off the hangers and stayed there. The Italian leather shoes, the silk ties, the custom shirts, with my initials embroidered on the cuffs, all of it stayed behind. Instead, I pulled on clothes I'd bought that afternoon at a thrift store in the Bronx. A pair of jeans with a rip in the thigh that I made worse by pulling at the seams. A faded t-shirt with a stain I couldn't identify and didn't want to know the origin of. Over that, a jacket that hung loose and misshapen, the zipper broken halfway down. The transformation was immediate and profound. In the mirror, my posture changed. My shoulders curved inward. I looked smaller. Then came the details that would make the transformation complete. I filled the bathtub with cold water and added nothing to it. No soap, no luxury bath salts. Just water that was brown around the edges because I hadn't cleaned the tub first. I submerged my hands, the hands that had signed contracts worth billions, and let the water sit on my skin. Dirty water. The kind that left residue. I found a handful of dirt from the landscaping outside my building and rubbed it into my palms. My fingernails, the creases of my hands. Working-class hands. Desperate hands. When I got out of the water, I didn't shower. Instead, I sat in the dark for a while, letting my hair dry naturally greasy, unstyled, exactly 3 days without washing, which was how I'd timed this. My scalp itched. My hair fell flat against my head in a way it never had when I was paying someone $300 every 2 weeks to make it look perfect. I trimmed my fingernails haphazardly, with old clippers, leaving them uneven and ragged. I didn't shave. I let the gray stubble stay thickening across my jaw like a shadow I couldn't erase. Then I went to the mirror. The man looking back at me was a stranger. I knew intellectually that it was still me in there somewhere. The same consciousness, the same memories, the same soul. But the packaging, the external shell that had been carefully maintained and crafted for 62 years, was gone. What remained was someone I didn't recognize. Someone worn. Someone weathered. Someone who looked like he'd forgotten what it felt like to belong somewhere. My eyes were the same color, but they looked different in this context. Smaller. More frightened. The face was the same face, but it read differently now. It read as desperation instead of confidence. As loss instead of achievement. I turned away from the mirror. I couldn't look at myself anymore. I packed a single plastic bag. Actually, I grabbed a bag that was already torn, already damaged. Already looking like something that had been discarded and then picked up again by someone with no other options. I threw in the few things I would need. The burner phone, some cash and small bills that would look like a homeless person's daily earnings, a thin jacket for the coldest hours of the night. For the last time I walked through my penthouse, the living room that had hosted charity galas, the kitchen where I'd had breakfast alone every morning for 12 years, the study where I'd made business decisions that affected thousands of lives, the bedroom where I'd slept alone since my wife died. All of it suddenly felt like a museum exhibit about someone else's life. I took the elevator down from the 23rd floor. Each floor that descended felt like another layer of my identity being stripped away. The Charles Whitmore who got into this elevator was not the same Charles Whitmore who would walk out the front door. By the time I reached the lobby, I was already someone else. The doorman barely glanced at me. And that was perhaps the most important part of the transformation, the moment when people stopped seeing Charles Whitmore and started seeing nobody at all. I pushed through the glass doors of my building into the February night. The cold hit me like a physical blow. It was the kind of cold that didn't just chill your body, it went deeper. It attacked your spirit. It made you understand bone deep what it meant to be exposed to the elements, without shelter, without comfort, without the barriers that money usually provides. I walked down Fifth Avenue with a torn plastic bag in my hand, and nobody looked at me. That was the strangest part of all. For 62 years, people had looked at me. They'd nodded. They'd deferred. They'd wanted something from me. Now nobody saw me at all. For the first time in 62 years, I was invisible. 3 nights sleeping on cold benches. The first night was the hardest. I'd walked for hours after leaving my building, my torn plastic bag clutched in my hand, not quite sure where I was going. The streets of Manhattan at night looked different when you weren't rushing between important meetings. They looked infinite, endless, full of spaces where people like me, people with nothing, could disappear. The bus terminal became my destination almost by accident. It was warm, relatively speaking. There were benches. There were other people who didn't seem to care who you were or what you wanted. It was a place where invisibility felt less like a lonely choice and more like a natural state. I found a bench near the back, away from the main flow of traffic, and I sat down. The plastic underneath me was worn smooth by years of bodies, and it smelled like decades of human desperation. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed and flickered, with an irritating rhythm, a sound I would come to know intimately over the next 3 nights. The smell of the terminal was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just one smell, but a symphony of them: stale urine, diesel fuel from the buses, rotting garbage, old French fries, and something else I couldn't identify, but that made my stomach turn. This was the smell of survival. This was the smell of people who had nowhere else to go. Around me, others occupied their own benches. A woman with gray, matted hair and a shopping cart full of plastic bags. 2 men arguing in low voices about something I couldn't understand. A teenager with his head down, earbuds in, pretending he wasn't there. An old man sleeping with his mouth open, making a sound like distant thunder. The fluorescent lights above cast everything in a sickly yellow glow that turned skin gray and made the world look like a black and white photograph someone had colorized poorly. Every few minutes, a bus would roar past the windows, shaking the terminal with its arrival and departure. Every time one did, I flinched. I couldn't sleep that first night. Not because of the bench, though that was terrible. Not because of the cold, though that was relentless. I couldn't sleep because my mind wouldn't stop racing. Somewhere in this city, my sons were sleeping in their own beds, expensive beds with expensive sheets. Brandon in his mansion in the Hamptons. James in his glass apartment in San Francisco. Kyle in his modest home in Asheville. What would they think if they could see me now? By the second day, my body was breaking down. My shoulders ached from the bench. My legs were stiff. I hadn't eaten since before I left my penthouse. The hunger was there, gnawing at me, but more than that was the cold. It seeped through my clothes and into my bones. I understood for the first time in my life what it meant to be truly vulnerable to the elements. That second night, someone sat down next to me. I didn't notice her at first. I was too deep in my own misery. But then she spoke, her voice rough like gravel. "You new to this?" I looked over. The woman was older than me, or at least she looked it. She was probably in her mid-50s, but the street had aged her faster than time alone could manage. Her face was weathered, her hands calloused and stained. Her hair was pulled back in a loose braid that had come half undone, leaving strands hanging around her face like gray snakes. She wore layers of clothes, each one more threadbare than the last, and a coat that had once been blue, but was now a color that had no name. Her eyes, though, her eyes were still sharp, still present, still human. I started, then stopped. What was I supposed to say? That I'd been homeless for 24 hours, that this was a test, that I was actually a CEO sleeping on a bus terminal bench to verify whether my sons loved me? "Yeah, you're new," she said, not waiting for me to finish. "I can tell. You've still got that look, that panic, that this can't be my life look. It goes away after a while." "How long is a while?" I asked. She pulled a piece of bread from her jacket pocket. It was wrapped in a paper napkin, and she carefully unwrapped it like it was the most precious thing in the world. Then she broke it in half and offered me one piece. "I'm Patricia," she said. "I've been out here for 5 years. 5 years." The number hit me harder than it should have. 5 years of benches and cold and the smell of diesel and desperation. I took the bread. It was stale, probably from a dumpster behind a restaurant or salvaged from a trash can, but when I bit into it, it tasted like the most honest thing I'd eaten in my entire life. Not because it was good, it wasn't, but because it was real. It didn't have pretense. It didn't have lies wrapped around it. "Charles," I said. "I'm Charles." "Well, Charles." Patricia said, eating her half of the bread, slowly making it last. "Welcome to the bottom. It's not much, but at least you don't have to pretend anymore." We sat in silence for a while, eating stale bread in the fluorescent glow of the terminal. Around us, the city carried on. Buses came and went. People rushed past, not seeing us, not seeing people like us. The invisibility I'd chosen was now being reinforced by circumstance. "Can I ask you something?" I said after a while. "You can ask. Doesn't mean I'll answer." "How did you end up here?" Patricia looked at her piece of bread like it held the answer to my question. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "I had kids, 2 of them. I worked in an office for 30 years, kept a house, did everything right. And then my husband left, and the kids, they just decided I wasn't worth their time anymore. My daughter said she was too busy. My son said it was complicated. They sent money to my bank account charity, I think more than anything else, until I ran out of money. Then they stopped answering my calls." She paused and took another bite of bread. That was 5 years ago," she continued. "I've been out here since then. They don't even know if I'm alive." The words hit me like a punch. 5 years. Her own children had let her fall into the streets and hadn't looked back. What if Kyle did the same to me? What if he stopped caring? What if the test I was administering revealed that all 3 of my sons would eventually abandon me? "Do you ever think about contacting them?" I asked. "Every day," Patricia said honestly. "But what would I say? 'Hi, I'm your mother, and I've been sleeping on benches. Can you help me?' They made their choice. I made mine, I suppose. The choice to keep my dignity, even if it meant dying on the street." She finished her bread and carefully wrapped up the napkin again. "The thing about having nothing. Charles, Ma," she said, looking at me directly for the first time, "is that you finally get to see who people really are. Not who they pretend to be, not who they want you to think they are, but who they actually are deep down." "And what if they're all terrible?" I asked. "What if nobody actually cares?" Patricia smiled, and it was one of the saddest things I'd ever seen. "Then at least you know," she said. "At least you're not living a lie anymore." That night, Patricia stayed near me on her own bench. We didn't talk much after that. We just sat in the fluorescent glow of the bus terminal, 2 people with nothing, and somehow that felt less lonely than sitting alone had felt. When morning came and she was gone, I realized I'd learned more from Patricia in a few hours than I'd learned from my sons in years. By the second day, I understood what it truly meant to be invisible. It wasn't merely the absence of a place to sleep, though that was part of it. It was something far more profound. It was the slow erasure of existence itself. The bench in Central Park became my temporary refuge, though refuge felt like too generous a word. Cold concrete. No back support. Just the endless passage of people who looked through me as if I were part of the landscape, a weathered tree stump, a cracked stone, something broken beyond repair. The first night at the bus station had been shocking. The second night at the park was something else entirely. February in New York is merciless. The kind of cold that doesn't just bite. It settles into your bones and tells you that warmth is a luxury you no longer deserve. I pulled the thin jacket tighter around my shoulders, watching the city lights reflect off the frozen pathways. Joggers in their expensive athletic wear passed by without a glance. Parents with children hurried through, wrapping their kids closer to their bodies, perhaps to protect them from me, as if homelessness was contagious. I hadn't eaten since morning. A half-stale bagel from a trash bin outside a cafe. The humiliation of fishing through garbage, something I'd never imagined myself doing, had been worse than the hunger. An older woman had watched me with pity in her eyes, then quickly looked away. That moment of pity had somehow hurt more than any cruelty could have. By the second evening, my clothes were stiff with grime. The dirt under my fingernails had become a permanent feature. My hair, unwashed for 3 days, now hung greasy against my forehead. I caught my reflection in a shop window earlier and barely recognized the man staring back. 62 years of building an empire of commanding boardrooms and making decisions that affected thousands of lives, and it had taken less than 48 hours to reduce me to this. A couple sat on a nearby bench, sharing earbuds, their shoulders touching. The young woman rested her head on the man's shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence. I watched them with something I couldn't quite name. Envy, regret, the understanding that what they had, that simple human connection, that unconditional presence, was worth infinitely more than the $58 million in my bank accounts. Patricia's words echoed in my mind. When you have nothing, having someone matters. But what if having someone had never truly mattered to my sons? What if I'd built something so valuable, something so impressive, that they'd learned to value only that, the money, the status, the name? And now that I had stripped away all of it, who was I to them? Nobody. Less than nobody. The second night I actually slept a little. Not from comfort, but from exhaustion so complete that my body simply shut down. I dreamed of my wife. She was young again, smiling at me in our first apartment, before the empire, before the success, before everything got so complicated. In the dream, she took my hand and said, "Charles, this is all you ever needed." When I woke, my face was wet with tears I didn't remember shedding. Morning came gray and cold. A police officer approached, told me I couldn't stay in the park after dawn. The way he said it, not unkindly but without any real concern, reminded me that I was a problem to be managed, a resource to be relocated. I gathered my things slowly, my joints stiff, my muscles aching in ways I'd never experienced before. This is what age felt like when stripped of comfort and care, I thought. This is what vulnerability felt like when you had no resources to shield yourself from it. By the morning of the third day, something had shifted inside me. The despair was still there, crushing, overwhelming, but beneath it lay something harder. Something like purpose. I had lived as a successful man for so long that I'd forgotten what hunger felt like. Real hunger, real cold, real abandonment. I'd written checks to charity organizations for years, telling myself I was making a difference. But Patricia had taught me something no donation could ever convey, that the homeless weren't abstractions. They were people. Real people with real loves and real losses, just like everyone else. And my sons, Brandon with his ambition, James with his indifference, Kyle with his quiet kindness, they were living in a world of abstractions too. Money, status, success. They'd forgotten that these things were supposed to serve life, not replace it. The third morning, standing in the frozen air with nothing but a plastic bag and a burner phone, I made my decision. I was going to take this test to its logical conclusion. I was going to walk to each of their homes and knock on their doors. Not as Charles Whitmore, the CEO with a net worth of $58 million, but as nobody, as nothing. And I would finally see what my sons were truly made of. Hungry, freezing, and desperate, I was ready. I had lost everything. Now finally, I could see what it meant to have nothing at all. The journey to the Hamptons took longer than I'd anticipated. My body, weakened by 2 nights of minimal sleep and rationed meals from dumpsters, moved with the speed of an old man who had forgotten what endurance felt like. I took the Long Island Railroad sitting in the back of the car, where few people paid attention to the vagrant in threadbare clothes. No one looked at me. More importantly, no one saw me. The sun was beginning its descent as I walked down the oak-lined streets of the Hamptons. I'd paid for every brick, every tree, every blade of grass that lined these streets. I'd funded the development projects that had transformed this area into one of the most exclusive enclaves on the East Coast. And yet now, walking these familiar roads in my deteriorated state, I felt like an intruder in a world I'd built but no longer belonged to. Brandon's estate emerged like a jewel catching the fading afternoon light. The property glowed with the kind of effortless wealth that only old money or inherited money could project. The electronic gate stood at least 8 feet high, wrought iron with gold-plated accents, gleaming against the darkening sky. Beyond it, the driveway curved in a perfect arc through manicured lawns. Every blade of grass appeared to have been individually trimmed, every hedge precisely sculpted into geometric shapes that defied nature's impulse toward chaos. A marble fountain dominated the center of the circular drive water, cascading from some classical sculpture I couldn't quite make out from the gate. I knew that fountain had cost $140,000. I'd written the check myself years ago when Brandon was fresh out of Harvard Law School and wanted to establish himself as someone of consequence. The installation alone had cost another $30,000. The house itself loomed beyond the fountain like a palace. Pale limestone exterior with black shutters soaring white columns framing the entrance. The architecture spoke in a language of power and exclusivity. This wasn't a home. It was a statement. It was a weapon, my stomach growled. I couldn't remember when I'd last eaten. Was it yesterday morning? The 2 days of living on the streets had collapsed into one continuous ache of hunger and cold. I steadied myself and approached the gate. My hand moved toward the intercom button, weathered and hesitant. I pressed it and waited. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a speaker crackled to life, and Brandon's voice came through, not warm, not curious, just efficient and dismissive. "We're not buying anything. Not interested." The words came fast-clipped. He didn't even ask who was calling. "See, Brandon," I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, rougher, deeper, broken, in ways I hadn't expected. "It's your father." Silence. Then a pause so long I thought the connection had been cut. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted from dismissal to something harder. "That's not funny." "It's not a joke," I said. Another silence. I could almost hear him calculating, deciding whether to believe me or dismiss me as a lunatic. Or perhaps, and this thought struck me with unexpected force, he was calculating how much trouble this would be for him. "Hold on," he finally said. I stood at the gate for 5 minutes. Then 10. The sun continued its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I watched a couple jog past on the street, their designer workout clothes catching the last light, their faces purposefully averted from me. A woman in a Range Rover slowed as she passed, her eyes lingering on me for a moment, before her expression shifted to something like disgust. She accelerated away. The gate began to open. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if resisting the decision. Brandon appeared in the widening gap framed by the threshold of his palace, backlit by the wealth inside. He was wearing a polo shirt and khaki pants, casual clothing that probably cost more than my entire current wardrobe. His hair was perfect. His posture was rigid. His face was a carefully constructed mask. And then he saw me. Really saw me. His eyes did a rapid scan, the filthy clothes, the dirt under my fingernails, the grease in my matted hair, the gauntness of my face. I watched his nostrils flare slightly, as if he could smell the degradation on me. And I watched his expression complete its final calculation. There was no shock, no concern, no moment of hesitation or paternal instinct. There was only something that resembled the face one makes when discovering a problem, that would require effort to solve. Dad, he said it flatly, a statement rather than a greeting. His eyes had already begun to ice over. What are you doing here? And what the hell happened to you? I opened my mouth to answer, but he held up a hand. Actually, I don't want to know. Whatever this is, I can't help you with it. I have Victoria's parents coming over in an hour, and frankly, this isn't something I need in my life right now. He stood in the doorway, his body positioned to block entry. Not quite closing the door, but making the message unambiguous. He was my son, but I was not welcome in his home. I was not welcome in his world. I was an embarrassment, an inconvenience, a problem to be managed and dismissed. I saw in his eyes what I had been afraid to see all along. Not the boy I had raised. Not the young man I had educated and funded and believed in. I saw the man I had created, someone who had learned to measure worth in dollars and status. Someone for whom family obligation was negotiable. Someone for whom compassion was a luxury item. He stood there blocking the threshold to everything he owned, everything I had given him, and he didn't invite me in. And I see, I said quietly. I spoke quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. Brandon, I'm in trouble. I've lost everything, my company, my assets, my home. I'm homeless. I need shelter tonight. Somewhere safe to sleep. And something to eat. The words hung in the air between us like a confession in a dark room. Brandon's face remained composed, but his eyes darted away from mine. He looked past me over my shoulder toward the street where the windows of his neighbors' homes glowed with warm light. I could almost see his mind working, calculating the risk. What if someone saw us? What if someone asked questions? Look, he said, and his voice had taken on a tone I recognized from countless business calls over the years. It was the voice he used when he needed to dismiss someone without appearing cruel. This is really sudden. I don't understand how this could happen. You have resources, you have connections. You managed a $300 million business. I made mistakes, I said. More than mistakes. Brandon replied, his jaw tightening. You should have been more careful, more responsible. Everyone knows the market was volatile. You should have diversified, hedged your bets. He said these things as if he were lecturing a college student not speaking to his own father, who stood barefoot and shivering in front of his mansion. I waited for him to offer something more, a phone number for a shelter perhaps, or the name of a hotel willing to take in a homeless man for the night. I waited for some flicker of the boy I had raised, some residual empathy. It didn't come. Victoria has important dinner guests arriving in about 20 minutes. He continued, glancing at his watch with deliberate casualness. Partners, people whose opinions matter for my career trajectory. I can't have... He paused, searching for the right word. Complications tonight. The way he said it, complications, the word landed like a punch. I was a complication. My homelessness, my desperation, my very existence in this moment was an inconvenience that threatened his dinner party. I understand, I said, though I wasn't sure I did. Or perhaps I understood too well. Brandon shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the silence. He looked past me again, checking to see if any neighbors were watching. A man jogging past on the street glanced toward us, and I saw Brandon's shoulders tense. He positioned himself to block the view, using his own body as a shield, not to protect me, but to hide me. I'm sorry, Dad, he said finally, and there was something almost theatrical about it. Really, I am, but I can't. I'm not prepared for this. This is too much. He disappeared into the house. I stood alone on the marble steps, my teeth chattering in the February cold. I could hear muffled voices from inside, music, the clink of glasses being prepared. Victoria, no doubt. The dinner guests. The important people whose opinions mattered more than his father's survival. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The sun had nearly completed its descent, leaving the sky in that peculiar state between day and night, where everything looks slightly unreal. I watched the shadows lengthen across Brandon's perfect lawn. I thought about the fountain. I thought about the hedge maze he'd asked me to install 2 years ago. I thought about all the money, all the investment, all the belief I'd placed in this man. Brandon returned, and in his hand, he held several bills. He pressed them into my palm without making eye contact. $75. Not 50, as his message to his siblings had indicated all those years of phone calls suggested. 75. It was insulting because it was trying not to be insulting. It was an amount that suggested he wasn't completely heartless, while simultaneously confirming that heartlessness was in fact the dominant feature of his character. "Now, this is all I can do right now," he said. I wish I could do more, but he didn't want to. That was the truth he left unspoken. I looked at the bills in my hand. $75. The nightly rate at a cheap motel, perhaps, if such a place would rent to someone who looked like me. Or 10 days of food rationed carefully. Or nothing. All of it nothing compared to what I had given him. "Thank you," I heard myself say. The words tasted like rust and ashes. "I'm sorry, Dad," Brandon said again, and this time he sounded almost genuine. Almost. "You understand, don't you? I have responsibilities. Victoria, the business, the partners." I nodded. I understood perfectly. He opened the door wider, and I could see into his home, the marble foyer, the crystal chandelier, the perfectly appointed rooms beyond. I could hear the clink of glasses, hear Victoria laughing at something, hear the ambient music that played in the background. A normal evening, a normal life. My money subsidizing his normalcy. "Take care of yourself, okay?" he said. "Maybe check into a shelter. There are organizations that help with these things." "Of course," I said. He was already closing the door, already pulling away his mind, already back on his guests and his career trajectory, and all the things that mattered more than me. The door shut. I heard the sound of the deadbolt sliding into place, a thick, deliberate click, followed by the sound of a secondary lock engaging. The metallic sound of the mechanism turning was like a nail being driven into a coffin, the coffin of my relationship with my eldest son. I stood alone on his steps, holding $75, watching the light behind the frosted glass of his door change as someone Victoria perhaps moved past it. I could hear their voices now louder now that the door was closed. Someone laughed. A cork popped. Inside, life went on. Outside, I was still freezing. I left Brandon's world of marble and exclusion with $75 and a burning resolve. The Greyhound bus carried me westward for 36 hours through Pennsylvania's gray industrial towns, across the vast American heartland, and finally to San Francisco's glittering skyline. James's building rises 28 stories, all glass and steel. Architectural statement more than home. When I pressed the intercom, a woman's voice answered before James spoke. "We're not interested." The speaker crackled. The voice belonged to Catherine, James's wife. She didn't ask who was calling. She didn't need to. "It's your husband's father," I said into the speaker. There was a pause. Then the elevator door buzzed open. Floor 28. The hallway was sterile, white walls, track lighting the faint hum of climate control. James's apartment door opened before I could knock. He looked at me like I was a delivery mistake. "That's you," he said, taking in my appearance. 3 days of homelessness, worn clothes, the visible desperation of a man without a place to sleep. "Yes," I said quietly. He stepped aside, just enough for me to enter, then closed the door behind me with a soft, final click. The apartment was beautiful in the way expensive things are, all open-floor, plan floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay furniture that looked carefully selected by someone paid to understand aesthetics, but not comfort. There were no photographs, no signs of life, just glass steel and the careful curation of status. Catherine appeared from the kitchen, saw me, and something flickered across her face. Not warmth, not disgust exactly. Just the calculation of someone assessing an unexpected complication. James, who is... She started, then stopped. The resemblance must have been visible enough. Father, James said flatly. He's homeless. The word hung in the air like an accusation. I need a place to stay, I said. Just one night. I'm hungry, I'm cold, I don't have... How do we have dinner guests arriving in 2 hours? Catherine interrupted. Important clients. James can't have complications. James looked at me the way an engineer might examine a failed prototype. Something that should have worked, but didn't. Dad, he said, and the word sounded foreign in his mouth. I can't help you tonight. Catherine's right. This isn't a good time. I'd heard similar words from Brandon, but this was different. Brandon's rejection came from shame. James's came from pure calculation. He was already managing the variables, how my presence would affect his professional reputation, how to minimize the disruption, how to make me disappear. You should have been more careful, James said, echoing Brandon's words almost verbatim, as if rejection came with a script. With money, with planning. You're a smart man. You should have known better. The apartment suddenly felt even colder. Through the windows, San Francisco glittered below us, a city full of millions of people, and I had never felt so invisible. I can give you money, James said, pulling out his wallet. He removed several bills, not a crumpled offering like Brandon, but a deliberate transaction. He handed me $100 with the clinical precision of someone paying a contractor. There's a shelter downtown, the Harbor Light. They have beds. They'll take you. I looked at the money in my hand. $100. Twice what Brandon gave me. More money, less humanity. It felt worse somehow, more insulting in its sufficiency. James was already moving toward the kitchen, his mind already pivoting to dinner preparations, already erasing this encounter from his evening script. James, I said, can I at least... No. He said not unkindly, but absolutely. I'm sorry. But no. Catherine touched his arm, a gesture of support and alignment. They were partners in this moment, united in their assessment that I was a problem to be managed, not a person to be helped. I moved toward the door. James didn't stop me. He simply opened it, a gentleman's gesture that felt like a rejection nonetheless. The elevator ride down was silent and long. I watched the floor numbers descend, 28, 27, 26, each one, taking me further away from a son who saw me as a calculation instead of a father. $100. That was the measure of James Whitmore's compassion. It was enough to survive another night, but not enough to restore any faith in the man I had raised. Outside, the San Francisco evening was cool and indifferent. The city moved around me, people in expensive coats, people with places to be. I stood on the sidewalk with $100, 3 days of homelessness, and 2 sons who had closed their doors. But I still had one left. Inside James's apartment, the silence felt deliberate. I had told him everything about Brandon's rejection, about the $75, about 3 days of walking through cities that didn't want me. I told him about hunger and cold, and the particular loneliness of invisibility. James listened with his hands clasped together, his eyes moving methodically across my face, as though he were debugging code, looking for the logical flaw in my narrative. His expression never changed. There was no anger, no sadness, no compassion. Just calculation. Catherine had retreated to the bedroom. I could hear her voice on the phone, coordinating with the caterers, confirming the dinner reservations. The dinner guests. Always the dinner guests. Always the thing more important than a father without a home. I heard about your wife, I said carefully. I heard that she's expecting. I hope... James's jaw tightened. That's not something we discuss with strangers, I'm not a stranger, I said. I'm your father. Are you? James replied, and the question wasn't rhetorical. It was genuine. In his mind, apparently, the title required conditions, financial stability, a permanent address, a certain level of accomplishment. I no longer qualified. The thing is, Dad, he continued, and the word came out like he was practicing a foreign language. Tomorrow, I have a critical system deployment scheduled. The entire platform is launching. We've been building this for 18 months, and if something goes wrong, the company loses millions. Literally millions. The client will withdraw their contract. People will lose their jobs. He paused, letting the weight of this settle. I need to be present, he said. Focused. I can't have distractions tonight. I can't have my head somewhere else when I should be reviewing code, preparing contingency plans, making sure everything is perfect. It was a reasonable argument. I could hear the logic in it, the same logic that had built his career, that had gotten him to floor 28 of a building in San Francisco, that had paid for everything in this cold, beautiful apartment. It was also the most selfish thing I'd ever heard. So this is about work, I said quietly. This is about responsibility, James corrected. This is about being someone people can count on. Someone who shows up. Someone who doesn't fall apart and end up homeless and asking for help from his son. The words landed like stones. I felt the old anger rising in my chest. Anger at myself for raising a man who could speak these words and not hear himself. Anger at the culture that had raised him to believe that professional achievement justified human indifference. Anger that I had spent so many years building Whitmore Pharmaceuticals, while my sons learned that people were obstacles to be managed, not loved. I see, I said simply. James stood and walked to his desk. He opened a drawer and removed several bills, not the crumpled gesture of Brandon, but a clean, deliberate transaction. He counted out $100 and handed it to me with the clinical precision of a man paying an invoice. This should get you a bed at a shelter, some food, maybe a change of clothes. It's enough to bridge to tomorrow. Bridge to tomorrow. As if my life was a software deployment he was troubleshooting. There's a place called the Harbor Light, he continued. Downtown. They have beds. They have services. They'll help you. I took the money. $100, twice what Brandon had given me. The math felt obscene, as though doubling the amount could compensate for having the humanity. James, I said, can we just sit for a moment? Can we just talk, father and son? He was already moving toward the kitchen, his mind pivoting back to the deployment, back to the thing that mattered to him. I can't, he said. I'm sorry, but I can't. Catherine emerged from the bedroom, dressed now for dinner, ready for the guests who would arrive soon. She looked at me with the kind of pity that felt like contempt. I'll show you to the door, James said. I looked at my son, this man I had raised, this man I had paid for Stanford computer science, this man I had given every advantage to. And I saw clearly that I had failed. Not because he was cold, but because I had taught him that coldness was efficiency. That dismissing a desperate person was simply good time management. At the door, James did something unexpected. He placed his hand on my shoulder. Oh, you're a smart man, he said, and the words mirrored Brandon's. You should have known better. You should have planned for this. It was advice offered with almost paternal concern, the greatest cruelty to offer judgment wrapped in reasonableness. You're right, I said quietly. I should have known better. There's a shelter, he repeated. Harbor Light. They'll take care of you. The elevator doors closed on his face. As I descended, I realized something. James hadn't given me $100 out of compassion. He'd given me exactly enough to disappear. Exactly enough to make the problem go away. $75 from Brandon. $100 from James. 2 reasons for desperation. 2 sons who had chosen calculation over connection. But I still had 1 son left. and I was betting everything that he would be different. Asheville, North Carolina felt like stepping into a different country. After the sharp angles of San Francisco and the ostentatious wealth of the Hamptons, this small mountain town existed in a completely different universe. There were trees here. Real trees, not the sculptured imitations that adorned Brandon's estate. There was a gentleness to the architecture, a sense that buildings had been designed to fit into their environment rather than dominate it. I'd taken the bus, then hitchhiked the final miles. A young couple had picked me up. They barely glanced at my appearance, just asked where I was headed. When I told them Kyle's address, the driver nodded and said, "Nice area. Lots of good people over that way." It was the first time in 3 days that someone had shown me basic human kindness without an ulterior motive. Kyle's house sat on a quiet street lined with modest homes. It was small, a one-story place with pale yellow siding that had weathered to the color of old cream. There was a garden in the front yard, still holding some stubborn vegetables despite the approaching winter. The fence was simple wooden pickets, painted white but chipped in places. Nothing about it screamed wealth or importance. Everything about it whispered home. This was where I had sent my youngest son, my third son, the one who had seemed in my eyes to be making a mistake. The mechanic. The one who had turned down my offers of graduate school funding. The one who had chosen a vocational path when he could have followed his brothers into the professions. The one I had, if I'm honest, pitied just a little. Standing outside his door, I understood how wrong I had been. Kyle's house was small, humble, genuine. And when the door opened, I saw something I thought I had lost forever: real love. The woman who opened the door was in her late 20s, wearing an apron dusted with flour. Her hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and there was a smudge of something, perhaps chocolate, on her cheek. She looked confused for a moment, taking in my appearance with an expression that shifted from puzzlement to concern in an instant. But what came out of her mouth was not the careful, measured response of someone calculating social risk. "Oh my God, what happened to you?" she said, and there was genuine alarm in her voice. Real alarm. The kind that comes from actually caring about another human being's welfare. She didn't ask my name. She didn't glance toward her neighbor's windows. She didn't perform any of the careful social calculations that had governed my encounters with Brandon and James. She simply looked at me, a homeless man in filthy clothes, with 3 days of grime caked into my skin, and saw someone in distress who needed help. "Come in," she said, reaching out and gently guiding me over the threshold. Come in, come in. You're freezing. Get inside. It's warm in here." I realized, even in my shock, that I had never heard Brandon or James say those things. Come in. Get warm. I realized they had never once asked about my comfort or physical welfare. They had been preoccupied with how my situation might affect them. This woman, this stranger who was, I now understood, Kyle's wife, was concerned about me. I stepped inside, and the house enveloped me in warmth, both literal and spiritual. There was a fire burning in a small fireplace. The air smelled like something cooking soup, perhaps, or stew. The furniture was simple and worn, the kind that had been accumulated over time rather than purchased as a matching set. There were books on shelves, photographs on walls, evidence of a life being lived rather than a lifestyle being maintained. And I'm Sophie. The woman set her hand still on my shoulder as if afraid I might disappear if she let go. Kyle's wife? You must be his father. He's mentioned you 1,000 times. Sophie. Even her name seemed kind. Let me get you a towel. She continued, already moving toward what I assumed was a bathroom. And some dry clothes. Kyle's about your size. He's downstairs working on a car engine, but I'll call him up. She helped me out of my filthy jacket with the efficiency of someone used to caring for people. She didn't make me feel like a burden. She made me feel like someone she had been waiting for. Kyle, she called down the basement stairs. Kyle, come here. Your dad is here. There was a pause. Then the sound of something heavy being set down. Footsteps on stairs. The sound of a basement door opening. I stood there in Sophie's living room, in dry clothes that smelled like laundry detergent. My cold hands wrapped around a mug of hot tea she'd pressed into them, and I waited to see what my youngest son would do. Sophie had brought me inside without a single question. She had offered warmth and shelter and tea, and she had done it all as naturally as if I were a family member arriving for a long-planned visit. She had done what Brandon and James had failed to do. She had simply accepted me. What I didn't know, what I couldn't possibly have known, was that Sophie's instinctive compassion was about to be tested in ways I never could have anticipated. What I didn't know was that Kyle's acceptance of his father's need would be about to prove something profound about his character, his marriage, and the values he actually held dear. What I didn't know was that the next few hours would contain truths that would reshape everything I thought I understood about my own children. Kyle appeared at the bottom of the stairs, still wiping his hands on a rag. He was covered in grease, the kind that comes from spending a day working on engines. When he saw me standing in his living room, cleaned up slightly by Sophie's ministrations, his expression transformed in an instant. It wasn't shock at my appearance. It was alarm. Real alarm. The kind that comes from caring about another person's welfare above all else. He said it like a question and a prayer at the same time. Dad, are you okay? Did someone hurt you? The question was so foreign to anything I'd experienced in the last 18 hours that it took me a moment to process it. Not, what happened, or how did you end up homeless? Not, this is an inconvenience, or I can't help you right now. Just, are you okay? Did someone hurt you? Kyle didn't ask about money. He didn't glance at the windows or worry about his neighbors' opinions. He looked at his father, a homeless man in his living room, and his only concern was my safety and well-being. I'm okay, I said, and the words felt strange coming out of my mouth. I've had a difficult few days. Kyle stepped closer and put his hand on my shoulder. The gesture was so simple, so completely devoid of self-consciousness or calculation, that I felt something shift inside me. Sophie returned from wherever she'd been in the house, her movements efficient and purposeful. Dad, you're staying in our bed, she said without preamble. Kyle and I will take the couch. No, I protested immediately. I can't ask you to do that. I'll sleep on the couch. Really, I don't want to be a burden. Sophie looked at me with an expression of such clarity that it was almost confrontational. Family doesn't leave family on the couch when there's a bed available. That's not how we do things. She said it not as a suggestion or an offer, but as a statement of fact. This was not negotiable. This was the way things worked in Kyle's house. Kyle had been watching this exchange, and I saw him exchange a glance with Sophie. There was something in that glance, something unspoken, something that passed between them like a current. It was almost as if they shared some understanding that went deeper than the surface level of the moment. Kyle's expression held a kind of knowing, as if he'd anticipated something about this situation that I couldn't quite grasp. I didn't have time to wonder about it. Sophie had already guided me to their bedroom and was laying out clean towels on the bed. The bathroom is through here, she said. There's hot water. Take your time. I stood under the stream of hot water for what felt like an hour. The temperature was perfect, not scalding, not tepid, but genuinely comforting. As I washed away 3 days of accumulated grime, I felt something else washing away too. The anxiety. The desperate edge that had been threatening to consume me. The fear that had driven me through the Hamptons and San Francisco with nothing but $75 and $100 to show for my efforts. When I emerged from the bathroom, Sophie had laid out clean clothes, Kyle's clothes sized appropriately, and left me alone in the bedroom to dress. Kyle and Sophie were waiting in the kitchen when I came out. The table was set, and Sophie placed a bowl of vegetable soup in front of me. Just soup. Simple homemade soup. But it smelled like care. It smelled like someone had spent time preparing it, thinking about nutrition and comfort, and the practical needs of keeping another human being alive. I took a spoonful, and it tasted like something I'd forgotten existed. Not just food, nourishment given with thought. Kindness ladled into a bowl. Kyle and Sophie sat down with me. They didn't wait in another room or keep their distance. They sat at the table and Sophie asked, "Do you like it? I can make you more if you want." "It's perfect," I said, and meant it in ways that had nothing to do with the soup itself. Kyle didn't ask about my business collapse. He didn't probe about the bankruptcy or the lost assets. He just sat with me while I ate, and when I was done, he cleared the bowl and brought me tea without being asked. "Do you want to talk about it?" Kyle asked gently. "Or would you rather just rest?" It was such a simple question, such a straightforward offering of choice. Brandon and James had made decisions for me, had handled me according to their own calculations. Kyle was simply asking what I needed. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't really know what I need right now." Sophie reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You need rest," she said. "And food, and warmth. We can figure out the rest tomorrow." There was no pity in her voice, no sense of doing charity work or fulfilling an obligation. There was just the practical kindness of someone who understood that sometimes people need help, and sometimes helping people is the right thing to do. I looked at my youngest son, at the man who had never asked me for anything except the gift of my presence, and I understood something that perhaps I should have understood much earlier. Kyle had not become successful in the way Brandon and James had become successful. He had not achieved the corporate triumphs or the professional accolades that I had once thought mattered. But he had achieved something far more valuable. He had become the kind of person who could look at another human being in distress and choose compassion without hesitation. Sophie fell asleep on the couch first. I could hear her soft breathing from the living room. Kyle sat with me a while longer, not speaking, just present. Eventually, he excused himself and went to join his wife on the couch. I lay in their bed, a bed I had forced them to surrender, and for the first time in 3 days, I felt truly warm. Not from the layers of blankets Sophie had provided, though those helped. Not from the residual heat of the bath, though that played a part. I felt warm because for the first time in 3 days, I had been accepted without condition. I had been cared for without calculation. I had been loved in a way that asked nothing of me except to be present. It was almost too much to bear. I couldn't sleep. It wasn't the bed, it was comfortable, safer than any surface in 3 days. It was the overwhelming sensation of being cared for, accepted, loved, in a way I'd almost forgotten existed. So I lay in the darkness, my mind replaying Brandon's disdain and James's cold calculation. And then Kyle and Sophie, who had simply opened their door and brought me inside. The house was quiet, but voices carried from the kitchen. Kyle and Sophie speaking in hushed tones, thinking I was asleep. They thought I was asleep. I heard everything. That night, I heard something that changed everything. I heard the sound of true love. And I wept. "Kill." Sophie's voice was tentative, nervous. "We need to talk about something." "Okay," Kyle said, setting something down. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Sophie said softly. "Kyle, I'm pregnant." The words landed like a stone in still water. "You're... what?" Kyle's voice held shock, but underneath it, pure, uncomplicated joy. "I'm pregnant. We're going to have a baby." "Oh my God," Kyle said, and I heard him move, embrace his wife. "Oh my God, Sophie, we're going to have a baby." "We're going to do this," Kyle said with sudden determination. "I'll work harder. I'll take on more jobs. I'll figure it out." Kyle. Sophie's voice was more serious now. "We need to talk about money." I heard Kyle's enthusiasm falter. "Okay. How much are we talking? Medical bills, hospital costs, prenatal care?" We don't have insurance, Kyle. We don't have savings. And there's the baby's needs. Formula diapers, clothes. Kyle didn't respond immediately. I imagined him sitting down processing the reality of impending parenthood against their financial fragility. We'll figure it out, Kyle said finally. We always figure it out. Kyle will need real money. Sophie's voice was steady but weighted. We need to sell the rings. The silence that followed was profound. The rings, Kyle asked quietly. You mean the wedding rings, both of them? Kyle, I know what they mean to us. But we need... How much would we get? Kyle interrupted the practicality of someone forced to make difficult calculations before. Maybe $300, maybe $400, Sophie said. Combined with what your father gave us, it might cover the initial costs. Sophie, Kyle began, and I heard the hesitation. The wedding ring represented a promise, a commitment. Stakum. Kyle listened to me. Sophie said, her voice taking on newfound strength. Your father came to our door with nothing. He was rejected twice, he was broken, and we brought him inside. We gave him our bed. He needs us right now, Kyle. I know that, Kyle said quietly. The rings are just metal, Sophie continued. They're beautiful, yes. Meaningful, yes. But they're metal, Kyle. Your father is a human being who needs us. Our baby is going to need medical care. These rings can be replaced. But right now, they can do something more important than hang on our fingers. I heard Kyle exhale slowly. You've really thought about this. I have, Sophie said. I've been thinking since dinner. The moment I realized what kind of man I married. The kind who would welcome his broken father without hesitation. That's when I knew we could do this. What if someone asks? Kyle asked the small practical question that broke my heart. We tell them the truth, Sophie said. We tell them that we love your father more than jewelry. We tell them family is more important than symbols. We tell them our love doesn't need a ring to be real. I heard Kyle pull his wife close. Okay, he said. Okay, we'll do it. We'll sell the rings. Tomorrow morning, Sophie said. There's a pawn shop about a mile from here. We'll sell them and have cash before we tell your father anything. Edifie, Kyle said, his voice thick with emotion. You're going to be a mother. You're going to give birth to our child, and you're thinking about how to help my father. But that's what family does, Sophie said simply. And Kyle, your father's going to help us too. Eventually. That's how it works. That's how love works. I lay in the darkness of their bedroom, listening to the two people who had showed me more kindness than my own blood relatives, and I did something I hadn't done since my wife died. I wept. Not the angry, desperate tears of the past 3 days, but tears of recognition. Tears of witnessing something so pure, so true, so fundamentally human that it shattered every calculation I'd made about what success looked like. Sophie was pregnant. And rather than being a source of anxiety, it had become an opportunity to demonstrate the depths of their love, not just to each other, but to everyone around them. They were willing to sell the rings that had bound their marriage together, not because they didn't love each other, but because they loved others more. They loved their unborn child. They loved me. In that moment, lying in their bed in the darkness, I understood something that all my success and all my money could never have taught me. True wealth isn't measured in dollars. I lay on their bed and wept silently into the darkness. Not the angry tears of desperate men at the end of their ropes. Not the tears of a proud man brought low. These were different tears of recognition, of witnessing something so profound that my entire understanding of what it meant to be rich shifted in the span of a single conversation. I covered my mouth with my hand to muffle the sound. I didn't want Kyle and Sophie to hear. They had already given me everything they had. The last thing I wanted was for them to feel obligated to comfort me. I lay there in their bed, warm and safe, while they sacrificed their own comfort. And I understood something I should have understood years ago. I had raised 3 sons. I had given them the same advantages, or at least I'd tried to. I'd paid for Brandon's education at Harvard Law. I'd paid for James's education at MIT. I'd offered to pay for Kyle's university education, and he'd refused, choosing instead a vocational path. At the time, I'd thought he was making a mistake, a waste of potential. Now I understood that Kyle had learned something that neither of his brothers had managed to grasp. He had learned that there was more to life than achievement, more than success, more than the accumulation of wealth and status. He had learned what it meant to be human. I had raised 3 sons the same way, but only one of them had truly understood what family meant. The sound of movement came from the living room. Kyle and Sophie making their way to the sofa, the small, worn sofa that couldn't possibly accommodate 2 grown adults comfortably. I heard them arranging pillows and blankets, trying to create something approaching sleep arrangements. After several minutes of quiet rustling, I heard Sophie's voice soft and apologetic. "I'm sorry it's not more comfortable," she whispered. "It's fine," Kyle replied, and I could hear him settling his weight against hers. "I'm just thinking about Dad sleeping on our bed warm and safe. That makes me happy." I heard Sophie shift slightly, and then, "We did the right thing." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact spoken by someone who knew with absolute certainty that she and her husband had made the correct choice. I lay there in the darkness, listening to Kyle and Sophie settle into sleep on their cramped sofa, and I understood the nature of true wealth. I lay on their bed while they lay on their sofa, but I felt warm not because of the blankets. I felt warm because of their hearts. When I was 62 years old and had just lost everything, when I had been rejected by 2 of my 3 sons, when I had been reduced to homelessness and humiliation and the kind of desperate hunger that comes with having nowhere to go in that moment, I finally understood what money couldn't buy. It couldn't buy the kind of love that sacrifices its own wedding ring. It couldn't buy the kind of man who looks at his homeless father and asks, "Are you okay? Did someone hurt you?" instead of, "What are you doing here?" It couldn't buy the kind of woman who says, "Our love doesn't need a ring to be real," and means it with every fiber of her being. It couldn't buy the kind of family that welcomes you without condition, feeds you without resentment, and gives you the best bed in the house while they sleep on a sofa too small for their bodies. I had spent my entire life building an empire. I had made hundreds of millions of dollars. I had employed thousands of people. I had created something that by every external measure was impressive. And yet, lying in the bed of my youngest son, the son I had once pitied for his modest choices, I realized that he was wealthier than I had ever been. Not in money, in everything that actually mattered. In that moment, I finally understood what my wife had been trying to tell me in the weeks before she died. She had held my hand and said, "Charles, promise me you'll remember what matters. When everything else falls away, what matters is love. Just love." I had nodded, and I had meant it, but I hadn't truly understood. Not then. Not in those 12 years that followed. Not through all the business deals and the empire building and the accumulation of wealth that I thought would somehow fill the void she left behind. It had taken homelessness to teach me. It had taken rejection from my older sons to show me what unconditional acceptance looked like. It had taken Kyle and Sophie's willingness to sell their wedding rings, the physical manifestation of their marriage vows, to help a man they'd known for less than 24 hours to understand that real love isn't conditional on convenience or social standing or personal benefit. Kyle and Sophie had looked at me, a homeless man in filthy clothes, and seen not a problem to be solved with minimal charity, but a father who needed help. A family member who deserved to be treated with dignity and care. I wept in the darkness, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I had failed to teach my older sons, and humbled by the fact that Kyle had learned it anyway, somewhere along the way. And I made a silent vow to myself in that moment. Whatever happened next, whatever came after this night, I would spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the love that Kyle and Sophie had shown me. I would try to understand what they understood. I would try to become the kind of man who valued people over possessions. I would try to be in some small way the father that Kyle clearly was generous with love, generous with his time, generous with his heart. In that moment in that bed, that wasn't mine, surrounded by people who had become my family, not through blood, but through choice, I finally understood what real wealth looked like. It looked like Kyle and Sophie asleep on a sofa, too small for them, having given me their bed. It looked like the willingness to sacrifice everything that glitters for something that matters. It looked like love measured not in dollars, but in the beating hearts of people who choose every single day to love each other and to love me. I woke to sunlight streaming through the window. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then the reality of the past 3 days came rushing back: the Hamptons, San Francisco, Asheville. Brandon's rejection, James's cold calculation, and then Kyle and Sophie, who had brought me into their home and given me everything they had. Kyle was already gone. I could hear him in the distance, presumably getting ready for his job. By the time I made my way to the kitchen, drawn by the smell of coffee, he had already left. Sophie was at the stove preparing a simple breakfast, cheap coffee and toast with butter. The kind of meal that spoke of modest means, but genuine care. She set the cup down in front of me and sat across the table. The morning light caught her face, and I saw something in her expression that made my breath catch. She was looking at me with an odd intensity. Not unkind, but knowing. "Yeah, can I ask you something?" Sophie said, and her voice was steady, thoughtful. "You don't have to answer, but I need to say what I'm thinking." My stomach tightened. I set down the cheap coffee cup slowly. Since you arrived here, I've been noticing things," Sophie continued. "The way you speak, the way you hold yourself, the small details that don't quite add up to a man who's truly been homeless for 3 days." I said nothing. I couldn't. My throat had gone dry. "I think," Sophie said carefully, "that this might be a test." The words hung in the air between us like a confession. "How did you—" I started, but Sophie held up a hand. "I don't need you to confirm anything," she said. "I just need you to understand that I know, or at least I suspect. And I need you to understand something else." She paused, gathering her thoughts with the precision of someone who had been thinking about this moment, perhaps since last night when she heard her husband talking about the baby. "Whatever this is, whether you're testing Kyle, testing yourself, testing us, it doesn't matter," Sophie said. "Because there's only one correct answer to whatever question you're asking. And that answer is love." I felt something break open inside my chest. Kyle loves you," Sophie continued. "I love you, not because we know who you are or what you have or what you might give us, but because you're Kyle's father. Because you needed help and we could give it. Because that's what family does." "Sophie, I'm not going to tell Kyle that I know," she interrupted. "That's his decision to make if he wants to. But I want you to understand something, Mr. Whitmore. Whoever you are, whatever your circumstances really are, you came to our door as a broken man, and we chose to love you anyway. That choice doesn't change based on what we find out about you later." I stared at her, and I understood in that moment why Kyle had chosen this woman to be his wife. The door to the kitchen opened, and Kyle appeared already dressed for work. His movements were efficient, practiced. He glanced between me and Sophie, and something passed across his face, a moment of understanding perhaps, or recognition. "Morning, Dad," he said, using the word naturally without hesitation. "You feeling better?" The word better hung in the air. Not, "Did you sleep well?" but better. as if he too understood that this was about more than physical comfort. "I'm feeling much better, thank you," I said carefully. Sophie stood and squeezed my shoulder. "Kyle loves you very much," she said, and her voice carried a weight that seemed to encompass more than the surface meaning of the words. "Please don't hurt him." Kyle looked at his wife, and I saw the communication pass between them, the kind of wordless understanding that comes from two people who have decided to choose love regardless of consequences. "I won't," I said, and the promise felt larger than words. Kyle grabbed his keys and headed toward the door. "I'll be back tonight," he said. "Sophie, you going to the pawn shop this morning?" There was a pause. Sophie glanced at me, and I saw the decision being made in real time. "Yes," she said finally. "We need to take care of some things." Kyle nodded as if this had been expected. "Okay, I'll see you tonight, Dad." "Sophie, I love you. I love you too," Sophie said, and when she said it, she was looking at me. After Kyle left Sophie, and I sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what had just transpired settled over us like snow. "He knows too, doesn't he?" I asked quietly. I think he suspects," Sophie said. "But like I said, that's his choice to make. What matters is that he's chosen to love you. We both have." I looked at this woman, this remarkable, wise woman, who had somehow figured out within 24 hours that her father-in-law was testing his family and had decided that the correct response was simply to love him anyway. And I understood something. Sophie had understood the real test all along. I made the call to Howard early that morning before Kyle left for work. "Be here at 9 o'clock, I told him. "Bring the documents. And Howard, bring security. I want this done properly." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Howard was a careful man used to the whims of wealthy clients, but even he seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen. "Charles, what's this about?" he asked. 9 o'clock, I repeated. "You'll understand when you arrive." I hung up before he could ask more questions. Sophie looked at me from across the kitchen table, and I saw in her expression a kind of knowing approval. She understood what I was about to do. At precisely 9 o'clock, 2 black SUVs pulled up in front of Kyle's modest house. The contrast was immediate and striking. The vehicles were expensive, gleaming out of place on this quiet Asheville street. Howard stepped out first, followed by his associate and a small security detail. They moved with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to handling significant matters. The neighbors began to appear in windows. I could see curtains being drawn back, faces appearing, speculation forming. A small house in a modest neighborhood doesn't often receive visits from lawyers in expensive suits and security personnel. Sophie took my arm as we stepped out to meet them. She didn't ask questions. She simply stood beside me, a wordless show of support. Howard saw me, and for a moment he didn't recognize me. I watched the calculation happen on his face. A homeless man in 3-day-old clothes, unshaven, disheveled. His brain worked through the possibility before settling on the only logical conclusion. "Charles," he said, and his voice held a note of shock. "My God, you look terrible." "I've had an interesting few days," I said. Howard's associate stepped forward, ready to conduct business, but I held up a hand. "Not yet. We're waiting for 2 more people." As if on cue, a white Mercedes pulled up, followed by a gray BMW. Brandon emerged from the Mercedes, first perfectly tailored, perfectly composed. Then James, with the same careful elegance of success. Both of them stopped dead when they saw the black SUVs, when they saw Howard and his security detail, when they saw me standing on Kyle's porch, alive and present, and clearly very much not homeless. Brandon's expression shifted through several stages: confusion, then alarm, then the beginnings of understanding. James's face went pale. "What is this?" Brandon asked, his voice carefully controlled, but I could hear the tremor underneath. "Dad, what's going on?" "Come inside," I said. "All of you. It's time we talked about what really matters. Kyle appeared in the doorway behind me, and I saw the moment when both Brandon and James recognized the setup for what it was. This wasn't a crisis. This was a reckoning. We moved into Kyle's small living room. It was crowded now: Howard, his associate, the security detail, Brandon, James, Sophie, Kyle, and me. The room was filled with the weight of impending revelation. I stood in the center of the room and looked at my 3 sons. "On $75, I said, addressing Brandon. "That's what you gave your homeless father, along with a closed door and a locked gate." Brandon's face flushed. "Dad, I don't know what." $100. I continued, turning to James. "And the assurance that you were too busy with your system deployment to be bothered with my crisis." James opened his mouth, then closed it. His carefully constructed composure was beginning to crack. "And Kyle," I said, turning to my youngest son, "gave me his bed, his home, his time, his wife's willingness to sell her wedding ring to help me survive." Kyle said nothing. He simply stood there, his hand in Sophie's, his expression one of quiet certainty. "I came to you 3 as a test," I said. "I staged homelessness. I came to each of you to see who would help without condition, to see what you had learned about love, about family, about what matters." Brandon's face had gone white. I could see him calculating, trying to understand the implications. "Shaticha," Kyle passed the test, I said. "Not because he's smarter than you, not because he's more successful, but because he understood something that you missed. He understood that family means loving people when it's inconvenient, when it costs something, when there's no profit in it." Howard cleared his throat slightly. "Charles, perhaps we should—" "I know," I said. "Let me finish." I turned back to Brandon and James. "You're my sons. I love you. But I need you to understand something. Kyle is going to inherit the majority of my estate. Not because I love him more, but because he demonstrated that he understood what wealth is actually for." I paused, letting the words settle. "Howard is here with the documentation," I continued. "My net worth is approximately $58 million. The majority of that $28 million is going into a trust for Kyle's family, for his child, for his future, for his willingness to sacrifice his own comfort for a stranger who turned out to be his father." Brandon stepped forward. "Dad, this is insane. You can't just—" "Sorry, I'm not finished," I said quietly. "You and James will each receive $10 million. That's more than most people earn in a lifetime. But you'll receive it with conditions: family therapy, community service, a sincere effort to understand what you did wrong when your own father came to your door." James looked as if he might argue, but something in my expression stopped him. "Kyle and Sophie will also receive a house," I said. "Fully paid, a place where they can raise their family without financial stress, and $5 million will be allocated for their child's education and future." The room had gone completely silent. "But there's something else," I said. "Something important. Kyle understood the real test all along. He understood that the measure of a man isn't his net worth or his career achievements. It's his capacity to love without condition." I looked at my youngest son, and I saw in his face the reflection of everything his mother had been, everything I had failed to be for so long. "Pukila," Kyle knew, I said, looking directly at Brandon and James. "He knew, and he never told you. He never held it over your heads. He simply chose to love me anyway. That's the man who deserves your respect. That's the man who understood what family really means." Before I reveal what truly happened, and the moment that finally exposed the truth about my own family, I need you to do one thing for me. If you're still here, comment "still here," so I know you haven't walked away. Just those 2 words. Because what comes next isn't easy to hear, and it's the point where every illusion finally collapses. This is the moment when nothing can stay hidden anymore. And before we continue, a quick note. The next part of this story includes dramatized elements created for storytelling and educational purposes, and it may not fully reflect real-life events. If you'd rather stop here, you're free to close the video now. But if you want to know what was truly revealed, stay with me. Howard opened the folder. Inside lay 3 years of financial statements for Whitmore Pharmaceuticals. The company hadn't collapsed. It had thrived. Revenue skyrocketed. Profit margins exceeded projections. Every number told one story: there was no bankruptcy. There never was. Brandon's face went white. James stood frozen, his jaw clenching. "The company is worth $58 million, Howard said flatly. Mr. Whitmore did not lose everything. The silence that followed felt like a funeral. "Wait!" Brandon's voice cracked. "What does this mean?" I stepped forward. My voice was steady, measured. "It means the past 3 days weren't about money. They were about you." James turned away, unable to look at me. I walked out of this house homeless. I continued. No wallet, no phone, no identity, just a man in worn clothes, and I knocked on 3 doors. 3 of my sons answered. I paused. Only one invited me in. Brandon opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "You gave me $75, I said to him. "And you closed the door." Then I looked at James. "You gave me $100. You calculated my desperation like a business equation, and you locked the door." James's face had gone ashen. "But Kyle..." I continued, my voice catching slightly. "Kyle gave me his bed. His wife gave me warmth. They sacrificed their wedding rings to help a man they thought was a stranger." Sophie stepped forward and took Kyle's hand. He squeezed it, his eyes glistening. "But this wasn't punishment," I said. "This was consequence. I built an empire and never taught you what matters. I raised 3 sons and lost sight of what family means. So I became nothing, invisible, hungry, desperate to see who you truly were when status and money disappeared." Brandon sat down heavily on the sofa. His expensive suit suddenly looked absurd in this modest living room. "The Whitmore Pharmaceuticals empire is real," Howard said, distributing documents. "But the distribution of its wealth will be based on what you've revealed about yourselves." He turned to Brandon and James. "You each receive $10 million. Relief flickered across their faces. Then Howard continued. "With conditions. 100 hours of community service at homeless shelters. Family therapy, all of you. And a written letter of apology, not to your father, but to yourselves. For who you discovered you were when tested." Brandon's relief evaporated. $10 million, that's fair," I interrupted. "For men who can afford to be generous but chose not to be." Howard turned to Kyle and Sophie. "You received $28 million placed in a trust for your family's future, and this house is paid in full. Additionally, $5 million is set aside for your child's education." Sophie covered her mouth. Kyle looked stunned. "Why?" James whispered. "Because," I said, "you chose family over comfort. You chose to give rather than calculate. You chose love when no one was watching." Kyle stood. "I don't want..." "You don't have to want it," I said. "But you have to understand why. The wealth you're inheriting isn't a reward for passing a test. It's an inheritance of responsibility. You showed me what I'd forgotten. Now you'll use it to remember what I should have taught all 3 of you from the beginning." Brandon stared at the documents. "So we're being punished?" "No," I said quietly. "You're being given a chance. $10 million therapy and the knowledge that your father saw exactly who you are. That's not punishment. That's honesty." The morning light filtered through Kyle's modest windows, illuminating the contrast between my sons. Brandon and James sat rigid, calculating loss. Kyle held Sophie close, tears running down his face, not from sorrow, but from understanding. "What happens now?" James asked. "Now," I said, "you decide who you want to be. You decide if $10 million and community service will teach you what Kyle already knows, that love isn't a transaction. It's a choice." Howard gathered his papers. Outside, the two black SUVs waited. Inside Kyle's small home, the real wealth was visible in ways no bank account could measure. Brandon and James would leave that day, their Mercedes and BMW carrying them back to their separate lives. But something had shifted. The test wasn't over. It was only beginning. Because true change, the kind that transforms a heart, takes more than 3 days. It takes the courage to admit you failed, the humility to learn, and the willingness to become something other than what you've always been. The room fell silent after Howard closed his folder. Brandon and James sat processing the weight of consequence. Kyle stood quietly, arm around Sophie, who was trembling slightly. I won't change the will today," I said, my voice cutting through the tension. "But I also won't fund your lives anymore, Brandon. No more monthly deposits. No more calling me when you need money." Brandon's jaw tightened. "There are 4 conditions," I continued. "Non-negotiable. If you refuse anyone, everything, all 20 million, goes to Kyle and Sophie, permanently." James leaned forward. "What conditions?" "Move first, family therapy, real therapy, with a counselor who specializes in generational wealth and family dynamics, every month for at least 1 year. All 3 of you." Brandon started to protest. I held up my hand. "Not second 100 hours of community service at homeless shelters. I want you to see what I saw, to understand desperation, to serve people who have nothing. Third, you apologize to Kyle and Sophie, not to me, to them, genuinely, for judging your father without compassion, for choosing money over family." Sophie's eyes glistened. "And fourth, you spend real time with your family, not business dinners, not transactional meetings, real time, with Kyle, with Sophie, with your nephew or niece when the baby comes." James stood up. "This is extortion." "No," I said calmly. "It's fatherhood, finally. I should have done this 30 years ago." "What if we refuse?" Brandon asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then Kyle and Sophie inherit everything. The house in the Hamptons, the apartment in San Francisco, the company, all $58 million. And I spend the rest of my life knowing I finally did something right." Kyle reached for my shoulder. "Dad, you don't need to give me money." I turned to him. "I know, Kyle. That's exactly why you'll receive it." The simple truth of it landed like a stone in still water. I pulled out my phone and showed them a photograph. "I heard you and Sophie in the kitchen last night. I heard about the baby." I looked at Sophie directly. "Congratulations, to both of you." Sophie wiped her eyes. Then I reached into my jacket pocket. 2 gold rings gleamed in the morning light. "I drove to the jewelry store at dawn," I said quietly. "I found the store where you sold these. The owner remembered you. He said you sold them with the kind of urgency only love creates." Kyle's hand went to his mouth. I could have destroyed you with that knowledge," I continued. "Could have used it as proof of your desperation, your naivety. But then I looked at Sophie, and I understood something about grace that I should have learned decades ago." I pressed the rings into Kyle's hand. "I bought them back. They're yours again." Sophie sobbed openly now. Kyle held the rings like they were made of light. "There's more," I said. "The house in Asheville, the one you're renting. I've purchased it. It's yours. Paid in full. No mortgage. No conditions." Sophie gripped Kyle's arm. "And there's a trust fund," I continued. $50,000 set aside for your child's education, elementary through college. Whatever your daughter or son needs, it's there. Kyle started. Let me finish, I said. This isn't charity. This is inheritance. This is what happens when a father finally wakes up and sees his son clearly. You sacrificed your wedding rings for a homeless man you thought was a stranger. You offered your bed. You offered warmth when you had nothing. I looked at Brandon and James. You offered money and closed the door. That's the difference. That's why the rings matter. Brandon stood abruptly. So we're the villains in your story? No, I said. You're my sons, and you're being given a chance to become better versions of yourselves. That's not villainy. That's love with teeth. James moved toward the door. We'll take the 10 million. We'll do the therapy and the community service. But we're not apologizing for who we are. You will, I said quietly. Not because I'm forcing you, but because someday you'll understand what Kyle understands now, that money is just metal and paper. Family is everything. The room held its breath. Kyle slipped the rings back onto his and Sophie's fingers. They fit perfectly. Outside, the morning was breaking into something new. Brandon and James would leave in their expensive cars. But something fundamental had shifted. The test wasn't over. For them, it was only beginning. 3 years later, I sit in Dr. Sarah's office on a Wednesday afternoon. All 3 of my sons are here. We've been coming every week for exactly 36 months. The therapy room is modest, soft lighting, neutral walls, chairs, arranged in a circle. There's nothing in this space that says money or status. There's only truth and the difficult work of becoming honest with one another. Brandon sits beside James, and for the first time I notice genuine ease between them. They've started talking. Really talking. Brandon works for a nonprofit now directing an initiative to combat homelessness in major cities. It doesn't pay well. He doesn't care anymore. Last month he spent a Saturday night at a shelter serving soup and listening to stories. He came home with tears in his eyes. James left the high-pressure tech world and now leads a startup focused on sustainable technology. It's smaller, scrappier, but it matters to him in a way the corporate ladder never did. He even apologized to Kyle genuinely, without conditions, for judging his choice to be a mechanic as somehow less worthy than a MIT degree. More importantly, he's learned to be present. He doesn't check his phone during family dinners. He actually listens. Kyle hasn't changed much. He's still Kyle. But the difference is that now his brothers see him. They finally understand, Brandon says, breaking the silence. I want to say something. I nod. I've been thinking about that morning. When you stood in our doorway. When you were homeless. He pauses, swallowing hard. I was so angry at you for testing us. But I think I needed to be tested. James nods slowly. I had built a life on the idea that success meant money and status. Brandon continues. And when you stripped all that away, I realized I had nothing. I wasn't anyone without the trappings. And that terrified me. Dr. Sarah lets the moment breathe. But then, Brandon says, looking at me directly, you forgave us anyway. You bought back the rings. You showed us grace when we didn't deserve it. And that changed everything. My throat tightens. We're not perfect, James adds quietly. We're still learning, but we're learning together now. That matters. Kyle reaches over and squeezes Brandon's shoulder. It's a small gesture, but it carries 3 years of healing in it. After the session ends, we walk outside into the North Carolina afternoon. The sun is warm, and the streets of Asheville are alive with people, tourists and locals, rich and poor, all of them just trying to make their way. We drive to Kyle and Sophie's house. The modest 3-bedroom that I purchased for them has become the center of our family now. Brandon and James visit regularly. We have dinners together. We laugh. We argue. We love. Sophie opens the door with a toddler on her hip. Their son Michael is 3 years old now. He has Kyle's gentle eyes and Sophie's fierce spirit. Grandpa, Grandpa, Michael runs toward me, arms outstretched. I scoop him up, and he wraps his small arms around my neck. The weight of him is everything. This is what I was too busy building to understand before. Sophie is pregnant again. She glows with it, and Kyle watches her with the kind of tenderness that makes me remember why I chose their path as the true inheritance. We gather in the kitchen, the same kitchen, where I overheard Kyle and Sophie decide to sell their wedding rings for a man they thought was a stranger. I bought those rings back, but the real gift was what they taught me, that love isn't measured in carats or metal. It's measured in sacrifice and presence. Over dinner, Brandon tells a story about a client at the shelter, a woman who lost everything and was slowly rebuilding. "She reminded me of you, Dad," he says. "That morning you came to our houses. She had that same dignity mixed with desperation." Did you help her?" I ask. "We're helping her," Brandon says. "Real help. Not charity. Partnership. She's in a job training program now. She has stable housing. She has hope." James raises his glass. "To second chances." We all clink glasses. Later, after Michael falls asleep in my lap, I sit on the porch with Kyle, while Sophie rests inside. "You know," Kyle says, "I never expected the money. I never wanted it." I know," I reply. "That's why you have it." "But I'm grateful," he continues. "Not for the money, for what it represents, for you choosing us, for finally understanding." I look at my youngest son, the one who saw clearly when I was blind, the one who taught an old man that wealth has nothing to do with bank accounts and everything to do with the people who love you. "Money buys many things," I say quietly. "Penthouses, careers, security, Mercedes and BMWs, but it doesn't buy the sound of your grandson calling Grandpa. It doesn't buy the warmth of a small house filled with unconditional love. It doesn't buy 3 sons finally talking to each other with honesty." Kyle listens. "That, I say, is real wealth." Michael stirs in my lap, and I hold him closer. Outside, the stars are beginning to appear over Asheville, and for the first time in my life, I'm not counting my assets. I'm counting my blessings. My name is Charles Whitmore. I am a man who built an empire worth $58 million. I am also a father who nearly lost 3 sons because of the blindness of ambition. The story you just heard is not a story about success. It is a story about failure and how I had to become homeless to understand what truly matters. For 3 days, I walked through the streets without money, without shelter, without identity. And in those 3 days, I learned more about the nature of wealth than I had learned in 62 years of building a pharmaceutical empire. Let me be clear, do not be like me. Do not spend your entire life chasing money at the expense of the people who love you. Do not believe that financial security can replace emotional presence. Do not mistake busyness for purpose. Do not raise your children to think that success means status, that achievement means isolation, that wealth is the measure of a human being's worth. When I stood in my son's doorways as a homeless man, I discovered something that God had been trying to teach me all along. God doesn't measure our lives by our bank accounts. He measures them by our capacity for compassion, by our willingness to sacrifice for others, by the quality of our relationships and the depth of our character. 3 lessons emerged from my darkest days, and I share them with you now. First, real wealth is not found in penthouses or stock portfolios. Real wealth is the sound of your grandson calling Grandpa. Real wealth is a warm home filled with unconditional love. Real wealth is 3 sons finally talking to each other with honesty and presence. Second, God tests us not to punish us, but to refine us. My test came through homelessness. Yours may come through loss, hardship, or struggle. But when God strips everything away, He does so to show us what remains, and what remains is what truly matters. Third, it is never too late to change. I was 62 years old when I became homeless. I thought my story was finished, but God's grace is infinite. 3 years later, my family is healing. My sons are learning. My grandson knows his grandfather not as a distant figure of authority, but as a present, loving grandfather. To Brandon and James, your journey toward humility and service has only begun. To Kyle and Sophie, you showed me what it means to love without condition. To my grandson Michael, you remind me every day why I chose this path. If this story has moved you, I ask 3 things. Comment below with your own story of redemption or family reconciliation. Share this message with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to rebuild broken relationships. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about Grace family and the true meaning of wealth. I want to thank you for following Charles Whitmore's journey to the very end. Important disclaimer. The story you have just witnessed contains elements of fiction carefully constructed for educational and inspirational purposes. While rooted in universal truths about family wealth and redemption, certain details and timelines have been dramatized. If this narrative does not resonate with you, or if you prefer different content, please feel free to exit and choose material that better serves your needs. Your well-being and peace of mind matter. May you find the courage to prioritize what truly matters before life forces you to.